Good afternoon. I'm going to dispel the original myth that I'm actually an anthropologist. That's a little bit incorrect. I tend to refer to myself as a closet anthropologist because I'm in fact a user experience designer. And what I primarily do is I work with clients to adapt existing products and then devise new products that take better advantage of mobile, of lots of the different emerging technologies that are coming up. But all of this is seen through the lens of user behavior, and more specifically, user behavior around the world, consumers in emerging markets in particular. So that's what we're going to discuss today. And I'm going to kick off initially with a quote, and this is from an analyst, business and technology analyst in the United States. And what she says is that to understand the Chinese internet sector, what you want to do is start by thinking about the products that you know and love currently in the United States, in Europe, in the UK, and then you change all of their names, you kind of lump a bunch of them together, you get rid of any fees, and you drop half of the ads. And so statements such as this, they're informative because they are correct, but they can also be a little bit confusing because there's no hint as to why this is happening. And when it comes to devising products that are actually useful for people, it helps to understand the whys, and that helps you understand whether you're making actual, useful, kind of long-term, thoughtful product decisions or simply reacting to what you've seen in other areas. So what we'll start about is kind of thinking about those whys. And one of the common things is to just say, oh, but it's cultural, right? I mean, China's different, other countries are different, they have different practices, it's probably culture. And culture is often a factor. In the case of digital, the next thing that people often think is, well, maybe it just simply has to do with internet penetration. And on this map here, you'll see there's areas that are bright, bright red, and those are primarily developed economies. You've got, again, North America, Europe, Japan, Australia. These are markets that got the internet very early on, and internet penetration is 80% or higher. But most of the emerging economies are very, very different. And you have huge markets such as India and Indonesia stand out as being some of the really light areas there, where you have almost 1.5 billion people really who have, where the internet penetration is maybe 15%, right? So huge variation around the world, and that may very well be a factor. And then, of course, income level is often something that we think about. And so if you think of the previous map, the areas that were bright red, in this case, are blue. And blue signifies higher income levels. And the rest of the emerging world has different income levels. But that still leaves about 3 billion people right now who have never accessed the internet, who are discovering the internet right now primarily through mobile. And those people have income levels in the range of about £2 to maybe £10 a day. So dramatically different from what we're used to. And all of these things do have an impact, but even when you combine them, they don't really still tell the full story. And in particular, when it comes to retail, e-commerce, digital aspects of retail. And so that's really what we're going to talk about going forward. And I will start by talking about China. Now, China, as we know, is very big. It has 14 cities with a population of over 5 million. And by comparison, in Europe, there is 1. And then it has 41 cities with a population over 2 million people. Again, in Europe, there are 3. So dramatically different scope. And China is constantly changing, right? The middle class is evolving at a crazy, fantastic pace. You have about 80,000 people a day who move into the middle class on a daily basis. I mean, it's almost hard to believe when you think about it. So there's this constant revolution of consumers entering the market. And so from a brand perspective, reaching the rural consumer is certainly a challenge because China is so vast. But in many ways, reaching urban consumers, there's 700 million of them in the cities, and these vast, bustling cities, that is as much of a challenge, right? Opening physical brick and mortar locations to reach these consumers is a huge task. So when you look at the Chinese market, and in particular the way the internet has developed, that really is the lens that you should see it through. To many consumers in China, shopping online, it's not just the modern or kind of new version of what we're used to, being a big, bustling kind of brick and mortar infrastructure that's been built up over 100 years. In their case, shopping online is the way that you shop for a lot of things. And because many of these customers are coming online primarily using a mobile device, that is often their primary or their only access point to the internet. So We've talked about geography, we've talked a little bit about historical factors, about infrastructure plays a big role on top of the culture, on top of everything else. Now, we'll look a little bit at some of the impacts. When you look at Chinese e-commerce, one of the first big striking things has to do with where people shop. So in the United States, Europe and North America are really broadly similar. Most people, they will shop with individual retailers. So you'll go to the H&M website, the John Lewis website, and you will individually interact with that retailer. And that retailer may carry other brands, but still it's a brand relationship with big retailers. In China, completely different. What people primarily do is they go to large marketplaces, and to the tune of about 90% of transactions on those marketplaces. And these marketplaces are like real life. They're big, they're bustling, they're very, very social, and they're very big and have lots of products. Now, the most popular one by far, the company that kind of dominates the market space in China is Alibaba, and they have two sites that are the main ones that consumers will interact with. So the first one is Tmall. Now, Tmall is for established brands primarily, so there you will find anyone from a Nestle to a Samsung, big established, either global or regional or even local Chinese brands, but they'll be the larger established brands. And there's about 200,000 of them on Tmall. So lots and lots of brands. And Tmall charges an entry fee. There's a bit of a vetting process to get in. Again, it's to ensure that it's only established brands, quality products. And then there's a commission for each sale. So Tmall makes its money from that perspective. But what it provides for brands is this huge package of value that's kind of unlike anything we see in the West. It's super high visibility, super high traffic, mobile optimized completely because a lot of the consumers are entirely mobile shoppers. And it's also very highly social. And so it's almost basically a virtualized version of the high street that we're used to, right? You take London, you look outside, basically you take that, put it online, and that's what they've got. And for that reason, large brands, even people like Apple, right, it just makes sense to be on Tmall. This is where you go. This is how you can reach a large portion of the Chinese audience. And it's a perfectly normal and viable thing to do. The second site, so Tmall was for established brands, and then there's Taobao. Now, Taobao is consumer to consumer, and then also smaller business to consumer. And so from that perspective, you can think of it a little bit like eBay, except it is still quite different. And one of the big differences is that it's not just for physical products, it's also for services. So as an example, this is a full-service travel agent, and they can sell you a package trip to Thailand, but they can also help you get your Thai travel visa, book airport transportation, get a SIM card. So the breadth is really quite different. And again, in the West, there's nothing really that compares to this. You go to an Amazon or an eBay, it is very much product-focused, even though it's a marketplace. But on Taobao, consumers can buy any number of things. And that's really the striking thing in China is wherever you live in the country, you have access to goods that you might normally have to go to the city to interact with or certainly to purchase, including cars. All the major car companies are on Tmall, and people will buy cars over the internet. And it's a fairly reasonably normal thing to do, especially if you're not in a major center. So we've talked about China so far, but it's important not to think of it only as a Chinese thing, and part of the reason that I bring this up is that once you understand the historical context, the social cultural, how they got to this and why they're doing this, it makes sense that there's other places in the world that might behave in a similar manner, and you can therefore kind of transpose those learnings to other countries. And that is in fact what's happening in particular in Africa. So this is Jumia. Jumia operates in about 10 markets in Africa at the moment, and it's a large marketplace in many ways similar to the Alibaba properties. And in Africa, the environment in some ways is even more kind of extreme at the moment. Whereas in the Asia-Pacific region right now, you have about 7,000 consumers for each large retail outlet. So if you think of it as a shopping center, for example, about 7,000 consumers per each of these. In Africa, you have, in certain markets anyway, so in this particular case, we're looking at Lagos in Nigeria, there are 60,000 consumers for one large retail outlet. Right? So the scope is fantastically larger. And if you want to get some more comparatives, in the United States, it's about 400 consumers, right? So the orders of magnitude, they jump quite a bit, but in Africa, it's a much larger group per retail outlet. And so, you go online, that's what you do. There's almost no really thinking about, of course you will do brick and mortar, it will happen, but you have to be online, and that's where the consumers will go. There's almost no other choice. So marketplaces, they're big, they're bustling. How do consumers find stuff? So there's various things that are emerging, and in China in particular, there's one item to call out. It's kind of unofficially called an online shopping neighborhood. And it's a little bit hard to explain, but what they've basically done, if you think of Pinterest in the United States, so a site that consumers go to, they create an account, and then they use their account to kind of grab and aggregate little products that they find that they like. So they curate a little package of things that kind of makes them feel like things that they would like to purchase, they'd like to show off to their friends. And so this site is very social. People can go pin things, grab things, and so on. But then they add an extra element to it. And so they've got the aggregation, but they add a referral model. So you can kind of think of it as a mixture of Pinterest and then something like a Skyscanner or a Kayak, where the aggregation in this case is done by consumers, but the brand then gets referrals for all of the transactions. So for example, you have this brand called Meili Shuo, and it deals in women's fashion. So you have consumers who go and aggregate products, and then with each outbound click from this site to a spot where you can go to purchase the product, which, to be fair, in China is often Taobao or Tmall. I mean, it's quite convenient for them that they have an ecosystem that's quite concentrated. So every time a consumer clicks outward, the site gets a cut. And in this particular site, it's to the tune of about 5 or 6 million outbound clicks every single day, and that was in 2012. So, you know, they've taken a model that in North America is more just a social site, but they've actually added kind of a monetization engine underneath. Now, we've talked about social in a couple different contexts, and there's an interesting thing that's happening in emerging economies that makes social that much more powerful. Now, this is a very confusing diagram. It's the only one I've been able to find that really tells the story, so I'll kind of walk you through it. So if you look at the horizontal axis, you have internet penetration, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And so you look all the way on the right, you have those countries that we very much talked about, North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, and they got the internet first, so they have high internet penetration, and they also have reasonably high social media use. The big difference, though, is when you look on the other side. So there, you have countries with very low internet penetration, so Indonesia, India, South Africa, but their social media use is just as high, and actually, in many cases, it's even higher. And a lot of this is down to mobile. People will get their first device, and either there's a social app already on it, if not several, or they will put a social app on it within hours or days. Often they do it in the shop when they purchase the device. So they get to social right away, and that basically becomes a primary means of interacting with all sorts of things, including brands. And China is no different, right? The Chinese social ecosystem is gigantic. There's lots of different types of social sites. We're going to talk about one which is right now a little bit of the poster child. And the reason is that in China, nothing ever seems to really function exactly the way it does in North America or Europe. So these social sites are also kind of platforms. And this one in particular is turning into quite the interesting platform. So this is WeChat. It's only about 5 years old. It hasn't been around very long. But it is mobile only, right? There's no desktop equivalent to this at all. So these are entirely mobile consumers. There's about 700 million active monthly users at the moment. And what WeChat does is, at first glance, it just feels like a normal social type of product, right? It has text chat and voice chat, and you can do some photo blogging and all of that. But it's the 3 items at the bottom here. So you have the API, highly customizable API, a payment platform, and a virtual wallet. And what that enables, first of all, brands to do is, rather than you simply creating a presence on WeChat, you almost create a mini site, or you can think of it as a mini app, an app inside of WeChat, basically, that can be kind of as big as you need it to be, right? And it has API integration. You can bring your own data in. And to give you an example, so these are some of the brands that I've subscribed to on WeChat, and the one in the middle here we'll see is Uniqlo. And so this is the Uniqlo app, and along the bottom, what you have is effectively a top-level navigation, the way you would in a website. And then when you click, you get a menu that opens, and that gives you your sub-level navigation. So you've got lots and lots of options and things you can do inside that space. You also have the ability to chat. Now here I'm chatting with Starbucks. It's not Uniqlo anymore. And chat either works with bots, or actual customer service agents that you speak with, or sometimes there's a combination, so it really depends on how the brand has set it up. But it's very customizable again, so you can create whatever presence you need, and underpinning all of this are lots and lots of consumers who have subscribed to the digital wallet and the payment platform, so any of this can be turned into a transaction in all sorts of places. And kind of the glue layer that helps these transactions work and makes them even particularly more interesting is QR codes, which in China are really, really popular. And what basically the QR codes do is they help to convert the online/mobile interactions into something physical world, or take something from the physical world and bring it back into the online platforms. And they do this in all sorts of levels. And I use this photo as an example. It was a Barclay and John Lewis promotion from a few years ago. And so it's not as if, this was not in China, this was in the UK. So these things are happening in the UK, they are happening in North America. But the difference in the case of China is that WeChat at the moment has 400 million consumers who have that virtual wallet. So the volume and the ability to experiment is so much higher. And the platform is really designed and heavily optimized to permit those types of real world to online and back and forth. So we'll pause for 1 second here and discuss why again, right? Because we've explained a lot of things that are happening, but until you understand the whys, sometimes it's easy to say, oh, well, this is happening in China, but maybe not somewhere else. So virtual wallets, payment platforms that are entirely through mobile, and virtual banking in general are really useful in emerging economies because the ecosystems, similar to brick and mortar retail, which aren't as developed, financial services aren't necessarily as well. And then also because the consumers are very different income levels, you have a lot of consumers who are considered unbanked. They don't have a bank account, may not have one for quite some time. And then of course, therefore, no credit cards, right? So how do you do retail and e-commerce without credit cards? So a lot of different payment methods have emerged. Most of them work through mobile. And you may have heard of M-Pesa in Kenya. It's been around for quite a while, but there are at least 200 different mobile payment platforms around the world, and most of them based in emerging economies. And another thing that brands often do that consumers really like is that if they can't pay online, which they often cannot, they will pay once the package arrives at the door. And that's really useful in a couple different ways. One is that each market is a little bit different, so there might be different payment mechanisms from market to market. And that also, therefore, enables consumers to pay in different ways, either cash or sometimes even mobile airtime is used to pay for products. But also it creates trust, right? I mean, e-commerce is new, shopping online or on mobile. You've got new brands that arrive all the time. You don't know who they are. And so it enables a customer to say, I've received my package. I trust that I have the goods. And so now I'm OK to pay for it. So when you think about what's going on in these markets, the brands and the consumers themselves, they're leapfrogging desktop and finance and retail. But in some ways, you can almost think of them as inhabiting a big kind of rapid prototype of not just the world that they're going to live in, but also in many cases the world that we are going to live in, because we're seeing many of the similar patterns, except for us they're embryonic, and they're also in an environment where we are still coming to terms with mobile and with digital. So while we have all these categories called offline and online and digital and mobile, and they're still fairly siloed, and we're trying to bring them together, in many of these markets it starts with an even playing field, and so you can try so many more things. And from a brand perspective, it's particularly interesting because you can try things that you might never be able to do back home. And so to finish up, I'll give you one last example. So, and some of these examples, you first hear them and you think, really, this is going to work? So this is in Russia. This is the e-commerce brand La Moda. And they had two challenges. One was poor postal infrastructure, and the other was payment on delivery, which is popular in Russia as well. So they kind of combined these to try something completely new. And so what they did is they have uniform delivery people who will deliver the packages to get over the postal infrastructure issue. They come to the door, and then they wait, and the person takes the goods, goes and tries them on. They can offer fashion advice if you're not sure what you're going to pick, and if something doesn't fit or whatnot, you just pay for the things that you want, and then they take it away. And when I first heard about this, it was 2 years ago, and I thought, this is really fun, but it's probably not going to scale. It's not going to work. A few years, months from now, maybe I'll have to take this slide down because it's just not going to be a viable thing, right? So that was 2 years ago. In China, this is referred to as a mobile fitting room. And Jumia in Africa uses this type of process as well. And remember, with Jumia, they're a big marketplace, so they don't just sell fashion, so it's not so much trying it on for them. Sometimes it has to do also with physical goods like a television set, and somebody might want to actually plug it into the wall and just make sure it's actually working. So, again, important thing to remember is all of these markets are a little bit different. The consumers, the circumstances, the goods that you sell, how people will experience them, and the level of trust and understanding you will need, it changes market to market. But once you start thinking about why consumers are behaving the way they do and how the markets are different, and what things just don't apply to what you might have done back home, and that's really when you can start to deliver products that are really suitable and fun and brands that people really love. So I will leave you with one last quote. This is actually from The Economist from a few years ago, but I think it encapsulates it quite well. And it says, "To Westerners, mobile banking is a new way of doing something old, but to many Africans, it's simply the really obvious way to do something new." Thank you very much.